Welcome back. Today we are making this absolutely decadent chocolate blackout cake. It starts with some insanely moist chocolate cake layers, which I keep in place by adding a little bit of ganache to my greaseproof cake board. Once my 7-inch cake layer was centered, I added a very generous layer of some milk chocolate ganache on top of that. I got it nice and smooth with some spins and my large offset spatula, and then I added on a layer of chocolate pudding. You could make your own pudding from scratch if you wanted to, but since we already put so much other effort into this cake, I figured it would be okay to do a little bit of a shortcut and just add some store-bought pudding. I've also made pudding in the past, and I'm sure it's because I didn't cook it for long enough, but my pudding was a little bit thin, and I always know that store-bought pudding is going to be nice and thick, so that's another benefit of using it. I then added on some crumbled up cake tops and some bits of milk chocolate just to add a little bit of texture, and then I repeated this process as I continued to build the cake up. So I really liked all these different textures. We have the ganache, which is going to set pretty firmly when you bite into the cake. You have the super moist and fluffy cake layers, of course. You have the silky smooth and creamy pudding. You have those little bits of crumbled cake tops, which seriously are my very favorite part of the cake, which is why I decided to sprinkle them in between the layers. And then the bits of chocolate add a little bit of a crunch, which kind of breaks up all of that smooth, creamy chocolatiness. So I really like that. You don't have to add them if you don't want to, but I think it really helps elevate the overall texture and flavor of the cake. Once I had all 3 of my cake layers stacked, I carefully pressed my 4th layer into place. I like to press down just to make sure that all the cake layers are settled and that there's not any air trapped between the layers. And then I covered the cake in a thin coat of ganache. So you can see some of the pudding was oozing out a tiny bit, and as I was doing this, my layers shifted. Feel free to use your bench scraper to just push them into place and make sure they're nice and upright. And then use your bench scraper also to get a nice thin crumb coat. I chilled the cake in the freezer for about 10 minutes until the cake was nice and firm to the touch, and then I added on a very thick second layer of chocolate ganache. For those of you who haven't made ganache before like this, ganache is really just chocolate and heavy cream, and you can make it in different ratios to make different types of things. So you're going to see later I actually use chocolate ganache to make the drips on my cake, but this chocolate ganache frosting, as I like to call it, has a much thicker consistency, and it can be used to cover cakes, to fill cakes, and it sets pretty firmly. Once I'd smoothed that second layer of frosting, I left kind of a rustic edge and then topped the cake with my leftover pudding and the leftover bits of cake tops. I just liked the way it looked, and this is a chocolate blackout cake, so I wanted you to be able to tell that just by looking at it. I wasn't fully convinced with the decoration on the sides, though. It just seemed a little bit plain, so I whipped out one of my icing combs and created some ridges in the ganache. The ganache had already set when I did that, so I had a little bit of pilling on the sides, but I chilled the cake and then just used a brush to brush them away. They come right off, and you can see we end up having a pretty clean finish in the end. Then I used my chocolate ganache drip recipe, which, like I mentioned earlier, has quite a bit more heavy cream in it, to just add some drips around the side. I just felt like this cake needed a little bit more life to it, and I wanted it to really look like a chocolate overload cake, and I think the drips definitely achieve that look. The last step was to add some of my crumbs around the base, just to bring the whole cake together, and then it was time to find the perfect spot to cut in. Fun fact, I actually like to cut into what I consider the back of the cake, or the worst looking spot of the cake, because no one's really going to see that once you cut the slice out. So here you have it, our absolutely decadent chocolate blackout cake. It's so moist and delicious. If you want to try this recipe, it's up on Chelsweets.com. So thank you guys so much for watching. Hopefully, I'll see you guys again soon.